Someone asked me if oral tradition in Islam is reliable, especially regarding the words of Muhammad. Now, in Islam, there are different sources of authority. The most well-known one, of course, is the Quran. And according to Muslims, the Quran is the literal words of Allah. And this is the highest authority in Islam. But there's another source of authority known as hadith literature. And hadith literature is simply the written traditions of what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. And so this would kind of constitute some sort of oral tradition because this is a documentation of the things that Muhammad said that have been passed down to Muslims later on. Now, hadith literature is not on par with the Quran. Nevertheless, it's still extremely authoritative. And the reason is because the hadith literature gives very practical examples of how to apply the broad principles that are found in the Quran. So, for example, the Quran tells you to pray. But the hadith will tell you how to pray, when to pray, what to say in your prayers. And so for that reason, hadith literature is very practical and therefore very important because it gives a lot of details as to how Muslims are supposed to live. In fact, Sharia law, which is Islamic law that is instituted in many countries around the world that are Islamic, draws a lot of their sources and a lot of their laws from hadith literature. Because again, hadith gives very practical applications to the broad principles that are found in the Quran. Now, hadith is composed of two main parts. There is what's called the isnad and the matan. Now, the matan is simply the actual narration or the actual words of what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. And it could be a sentence long, it could be a paragraph long, it could be even longer. The isnad, though, is what's called the chain of people who have transmitted that narration. And this chain goes all the way back to the person who heard Muhammad say it. And then, of course, they tell another person, that person tells another person, that person tells another person. And so the isnad is composed of that chain of people who have transmitted it. And so a typical chain of transmitters will say something like this. I heard it said from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, who heard it from so-and-so, all the way back to the person who actually heard Muhammad say it. And oftentimes that person might be, for example, someone who is close to Muhammad, like a friend or a companion, or maybe his wife, Aisha. Now, that last person in the chain, the person who actually hears it from Muhammad, is known to be the guarantor of the tradition. And the more trustworthy and reliable that the guarantor of the tradition is, the person who actually heard it from Muhammad, the more trustworthy and reliable is this chain of transmitters. And so many Muslim scholars, as they evaluate different alleged oral traditions of what Muhammad said, did, or approved of, try to evaluate which ones are authentic and which ones are reliable. And one of the key factors is by looking at this isnad, looking at this chain of transmitters. And the more reliable and trustworthy it is, the more reliable and trustworthy can they say that this tradition of what Muhammad said, did, or approved of is actually genuine. And here's one of the key points. It doesn't matter what the tradition is. It doesn't matter what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. So long as you have a strong isnad, so long as you have a strong chain of people who have transmitted this tradition, then this matan, this actual thing that Muhammad said, did, or approved of, is going to be true or considered to be authentic, no matter how bizarre it might be. Now, there are many Muslim scholars who have compiled these written traditions of what Muhammad said or did or approved of over the years. And in Sunni Islam, which is the largest group of Muslims in the world, they comprise perhaps 90% of all Muslims in the world, they look to the 6 people who are the most trustworthy and reliable people who have compiled these hadith literature. Now, the most trustworthy and reliable of those 6 is a guy named Bukhari. He was a 9th century Persian scholar. And he sifted through hundreds of thousands of hadith and figured out which ones were trustworthy and which ones were reliable. And because of this, I'm going to make the claim that Bukhari is perhaps the most important person outside of the Quran in Islam. Why? Because he single-handedly canonized the words of Muhammad. He single-handedly decided which sayings of Muhammad were true and trustworthy and reliable, and which oral traditions of Muhammad are unworthy or untrustworthy and unreliable. And so for that reason now, Muslims, hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world, look to the hadith literature that Bukhari compiled to figure out how should we practice our faith. Because remember, the hadith is very practical. It gives details about everything: marriage, war, divorce, prayer, so on and so forth. And Bukhari alone, single-handedly, figured out which ones were trustworthy and which ones were not. Now the question is Bukhari's collection of hadith, is the oral tradition that Bukhari has compiled and determined to be trustworthy and reliable, is this oral tradition reliable? Is it trustworthy, like they say? Well, I'm going to suggest that the answer is no, for 3 reasons. Number 1 is the date between when Muhammad said what he said and when Bukhari eventually compiled and wrote it down. So Muhammad dies in 632 AD, but it takes 220 years for Bukhari to eventually compile what Muhammad said, did, or approved of, for this oral tradition to be passed on, before Bukhari compiles it and puts it down. Because Bukhari produces his work between 850 and 870 AD, again, around over 220 years of time. So that's a lot of time to allow for oral tradition to be passed on from one person to another person, all the way down to when Bukhari eventually has to hear it. And allegedly, he was a master memorizer, and so he allegedly memorized all of these hadith traditions and determined which ones were trustworthy and which ones were reliable. Now keep in mind, that would be like us today, or having someone today, take the words of George Washington and have those words having been passed down for generation to generation all the way to today, and for one person to single-handedly figure out which sayings of George Washington are authentic and which ones are not. And again, keep in mind, he had to memorize, or he allegedly memorized all these things and figured out and determined which ones were reliable and not. That's like playing the telephone game for 220 years. And I don't think that you would consider such a process to be trustworthy or reliable. The second reason why I would say that this process was not reliable was the sheer number of hadith which Bukhari had to determine which were authentic and which ones were not. There were allegedly 600,000, and Bukhari evaluated these 600,000 and got rid of 99% of them and reduced them down to only 7,000, which he believed were authentic. So if Bukhari spent just 1 hour on each hadith, it would take him 69 years to go through all 600,000 hadith and figure out which ones were authentic and which ones were not. Again, this makes you think that there is some question as to the reliability of this process. And a third reason why I would say that this oral tradition is not trustworthy or reliable is that oftentimes it produces results that are strange, unscientific, or just plain weird. For example, in Bukhari volume 4, verse 543, Muhammad says that Allah creates Adam to be 60 cubits tall. Now, a cubit is roughly the length of, between your elbow and the end of your hand. And so 60 cubits works out to be 90 feet. In other words, Muhammad says that Allah created Adam to be 90 feet tall. That's incredible. That's bizarre, right? Now you think, well, maybe Muslims would say, well, that's just untrustworthy or unreliable. Well, they can't, because this is Bukhari. He is the most trustworthy person. In fact, they would say that they actually defend this claim. They say, well, maybe the earth back then was smaller, and if the earth was smaller, that therefore that gravity would be less, and if gravity would be less, and therefore people would be taller. And so they try to figure out ways to defend or rationalize this claim. Or one final example, in Bukhari 4, verse 616, Muhammad tells a story about Moses. And one day Moses is out, in the wilderness, and he takes off his clothes to take a bath, and he lays his clothes on a rock. And while he's taking his bath, the rock, gets up, takes his clothes, and starts to run off. And Moses chases this rock that is running off with his clothes. He catches up to it, he grabs his clothes back, and he hits the rock. And Muhammad says the marks on that rock are still there from the time when Moses hit it. So these are just 3 of many examples of really strange and bizarre oral traditions about what Muhammad said, did, or approved of. And again, based on those first 2 things that we talked about, the sheer number of hadith that Bukhari had to evaluate, and the time between when Muhammad said what he said and when Bukhari had to evaluate those things, which is 220 years, for these reasons, it's understandable that you would get these really bizarre hadith. So that's why I answer the question to the person who asks me, well, is oral tradition in Islam reliable, especially regarding the words of Muhammad? My answer to them is no, for those three reasons.